In Portland's bustling hospital corridors, a dedicated nurse was about to face her greatest challenge. What started as another exhausting shift took a shocking turn when she came face to face with financial manipulation. Samantha Williams wasn't your typical caregiver. For 3 years, she had spent her life sacrificing everything for her parents' comfort, known for her boundless generosity. When they casually dismissed her inheritance while expecting continued support, she had no idea she was walking into her moment of awakening. Samantha's quiet smile would lead to complete transformation. What began as family obligation would become fierce independence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samantha's alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m. The same relentless sound that had pulled her from sleep for 3 years running. Her hand found the snooze button with practiced precision. But her mind was already cataloging the day ahead, 12 hours at Portland General's cardiac unit, followed by the familiar weight of her parents' needs pressing against her chest like a stone. The shower water ran lukewarm. Again, her landlord had promised to fix the water heater weeks ago. But Samantha couldn't bring herself to push harder, not when she knew the repair would mean another expense she couldn't afford, not with her parents. Rent due tomorrow, and their utilities already 2 weeks overdue. She dressed in scrubs that had seen better days, the fabric softened by countless washes, but still carrying the faint chemical smell of the hospital. In the kitchen, she made coffee with grounds she'd been stretching for 3 days, adding extra water to make them last. The taste was weak, bitter, but caffeine was caffeine. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Honey, could you pick up some of that organic yogurt I like? The regular kind upsets my stomach now. Love ya." Samantha stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. The organic yogurt cost 3 times more than regular, but she'd learned not to suggest alternatives. Carol would spend 20 minutes explaining why her digestive system was delicate, how stress affected her differently than other people, how she'd raised 2 daughters and deserved small comforts in her retirement. "Of course, Mom," she typed back, adding a heart emoji that felt hollow. The drive to the hospital took her past coffee shops, where people her age sat with laptops and lattes, planning futures that seemed impossibly distant. She'd once dreamed of being one of the nurse practitioner with her own practice, maybe even a small house with a garden. Those dreams felt like relics now, carefully packed away in some mental attic she rarely visited. Portland General's cardiac unit hummed with familiar chaos. Samantha moved through her rounds with the efficiency of someone who'd found her calling, even if that calling had become complicated by everything else. She checked on Mrs. Chen, adjusting medications and offering comfort to anxious family members. She assisted with procedures, documented progress, and somehow made each patient feel like they mattered. "You're running on fumes again, Jake Morrison," observed during their lunch break, his voice carrying the gentle concern that made him both a good nurse and an increasingly complicated presence in her life. Samantha looked up from her phone, where she'd been calculating whether she could afford both the organic yogurt and her parents' electric bill. "Just tired. Long week. It's Tuesday." He pulled an apple from his lunch bag, offering half without asking. The gesture was so natural, so easy, that it made something in Samantha's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. "How's your house hunting going?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "Still looking," she lied, accepting the apple half because refusing Jake's kindness felt impossible. "Nothing quite right yet." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see too much. "Sam, when was the last time you did something just for yourself? Something that wasn't work, or—" he paused, choosing his words carefully, "or taking care of everyone else?" The question hit deeper than intended. Samantha found herself mentally scrolling through recent weeks, searching for any moment that belonged entirely to her. There was nothing. Even her rare free evenings were spent researching better deals on groceries or figuring out how to stretch her paycheck further. "I take care of myself," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "When was the last time you bought something you wanted instead of needed? When did you Last, say no to someone who asked for help? Samantha's phone buzzed again. Another text from her mother. Also, your father saw an ad for one of those Mediterranean cruises. Just looking. But they have early bird specials. She turned the phone face down, but not before Jake caught the gesture. Something shifted. In his expression, not judgment, but a kind of sad understanding that made Samantha want to defend choices she wasn't sure she could explain. They're my parents, she said quietly. After everything they've done for me, everything they sacrificed. What did they sacrifice? The question was asked without accusation, but it still felt like a challenge. Samantha opened her mouth. To list the familiar litany: working multiple jobs, going without luxuries, putting their children first, but the words stuck, because the truth was more complicated. Her parents had worked, yes, but they'd also made choices that prioritized their immediate wants over long-term stability. The auto shop had failed not because of bad luck, but because Richard had refused to modernize, had taken on debt for equipment he couldn't afford, had treated customer complaints as personal insults rather than business feedback. They worked hard, she said finally, the response feeling automatic. So do you. Jake's voice carried no judgment, only observation. Harder than anyone should have to. The words hung between them as Samantha's phone buzzed again. This time it was her father. Samantha, the landlord called about next month's rent. Can you handle it a few days early? They're being unreasonable about the timing? She felt Jake watching as she read the message, saw him notice the way her shoulders tensed, the small sigh that escaped before she could stop it. How much do you send them each month? He asked quietly. It's not sending, Samantha said quickly. It's helping. It's family. How much? The number felt too large to say out loud. Rent, utilities, groceries, the occasional emergency. That always seemed to coincide with something her parents wanted rather than needed. Last month, it had been dental work for Carol that turned out to be cosmetic whitening. The month before, a necessary repair to Richard's truck that included upgraded speakers and new rims. Enough, she said instead. Jake was quiet for a long moment, finishing his apple with the deliberate care of someone choosing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before.
Ow.
Sam, I've been watching you for months. You're exhausted all the time. You never buy anything for yourself. You work overtime whenever it's available. But you're still stressed about money. Every time someone asks about your future graduate school, buying a house, even just taking a vacation, you change the subject. Each observation landed like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples Samantha didn't want to acknowledge. I'm fine, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't. True, she wasn't fine. She was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Worried about a future that felt increasingly out of reach, and carrying a resentment she couldn't admit even to herself. Are you? Jake asked, and something in his voice, not pity, but genuine concern, made her want to tell him everything. About the dreams she'd put on hold, about the retirement savings she'd never started, about the growing certainty that her parents saw her support not as generosity, but as obligation. Instead, she checked her phone again. Another message from her mother. Don't forget the yogurt. Maybe grab some of those nice crackers too, the ones with the seeds. Samantha closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight settle over her shoulders like a yoke. She'd grown so accustomed to carrying that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. I should get going, she said, gathering her. I need to stop by their place after work. Jake nodded, but she could feel his questions following her as she left the break room. They echoed in her mind through the rest of her shift, persistent as a heartbeat. When was the last time? You said no. What did they sacrifice? How much is enough? By 6 p.m., Samantha's feet ached, and her head was pounding, but she drove to the grocery store anyway. Loading her cart with organic yogurt, specialty crackers, and the other small luxuries her parents had learned to request with the casual certainty of people who knew she wouldn't refuse. At the checkout, she watched the total climb higher than her own weekly food budget and felt Jake's questions pressing against her consciousness like a bruise she couldn't stop touching. The drive to her parents' apartment complex felt longer than usual, traffic moving with the sluggish persistence of another Portland evening. She parked outside their building and sat for a moment, groceries growing warm in the back seat, trying to summon the energy for another performance of the dutiful daughter. But Jake's voice followed her even here, asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. How much is enough? When was the last time you said no? And for the first time in 3 years, Samantha found herself wondering if the weight she carried was really love or something else entirely. Samantha climbed the familiar stairs to her parents' second-floor apartment, the grocery bags cutting into her palms with each step. The building smelled of old carpet and cooking oil, a scent that had once meant comfort, but now felt heavy with obligation. She balanced the bags against her hip to knock, hearing her father's voice call out its "open" from inside. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it the week before, cluttered but clean, filled with the accumulated possessions of people who'd never learned to downsize. Richard sat in his recliner, a travel brochure spread across his lap, while Carol bustled around the kitchen, her movements carrying the nervous energy that always preceded requests for money. "There's my girl," Richard said without looking up from the glossy pages. "Perfect timing. I was just looking at these cruise packages. Carol, show her the Mediterranean one." Samantha set the groceries on the counter, noting how her mother's face lit up at the sight of the organic yogurt. "No, thank you." No acknowledgement of the expense, just the satisfied smile of someone whose preferences had been anticipated and met. "Dad, we talked about this," Samantha said carefully, unpacking crackers that cost more than her own lunch budget for a week. "Maybe you should focus on getting back to work first." "Work?" Richard's laugh carried the dismissive tone she'd learned to dread. "Honey, I'm 64 years old. I've worked my whole life. Besides, the job market isn't exactly welcoming to men my age. These cruise companies offer senior discounts. It might be our last chance to see Europe." Carol appeared at Samantha's elbow, wringing her hands. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, sweetheart. It's not like we're asking you to pay for the whole thing. Just maybe help with the deposit. Your father's been so stressed about money, and you know stress isn't good for his blood pressure." The familiar guilt settled over Samantha like a well-worn coat. Her father's health, her mother's anxiety, her decades of sacrifice, the arguments had become ritual, as predictable as the monthly transfer that followed. "I'll see what I can do," she heard herself saying, the words automatic as breathing. "That's my responsible girl," Richard said, finally looking up from the brochure. "We raised you right." The comment stung in a way Samantha couldn't quite articulate. Raised her right to do what? To never question, never say no, never prioritize her own needs? She left 20 minutes later with promises to think about the cruise deposit, her parents' casual thanks following her down the stairs like an afterthought. The next evening brought Emma Rodriguez to Portland. Her best friend's arrival announced by a text that simply read, "Flight landed. Meet me at Clyde Common in an hour. We need to talk." Samantha found Emma at a corner table, already nursing a glass of wine and wearing the expression of someone who'd been planning a difficult conversation. Emma had always been directed, was what had made their friendship survive 28 years and 1,000 miles of distance. Tonight, that directness felt particularly sharp. "You look terrible," Emma said without preamble, standing to hug her friend. "When was the last time you bought clothes that actually fit?" Samantha glanced down at her oversized sweater, a clearance rack find from 2 years ago. "Nice to see you too. How was Denver?" "Don't deflect." Emma's dark eyes were serious as they sat down. "I've been watching your social media. No new posts about anything fun. No pictures of that cute nurse you mentioned. No house hunting updates. Just hospital selfies and family dinner photos that look like hostage situations." "That's not Sam." Emma's voice carried the authority of someone who'd known her since they were 10 years old and building forts in suburban Ohio backyards. "I've been your friend for almost 3 decades. It's my know when you're drowning, even when you're too proud to admit it." The words hit harder than intended. Samantha felt her careful composure beginning to crack. The weight of Jake's questions from the day before, combining with Emma's unflinching observation. "They're my parents," she said, the defense sounding weak even to her own ears. "And you're their daughter, not their retirement plan." Emma leaned forward, her voice gentle but uncompromising. "When was the last time they asked how you were doing?" Really asked, not just how's work, so they could segue into their latest financial need. Samantha tried to remember, searching. through recent conversations for genuine interest in her life that wasn't connected to her ability to provide support. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "They're struggling," she said finally. "Dad's business failed, Mom's health isn't great, and they're trying to figure out retirement without much savings. Because they spent their retirement money on what, cruises? Home improvements? Is that new truck your dad bought last year?" Emma's questions were precise, formed by years of listening to Samantha's careful updates about her parents' latest purchases. That's not Samantha stopped, remembering Richard's excitement about the truck's upgraded sound system, Carol's detailed descriptions of their recent anniversary cruise to Alaska, luxuries purchased while their daughter worked overtime to cover their basic expenses. "You know what my parents did when money got tight?" Emma continued. "They downsized. Sold the house, moved to a smaller apartment, adjusted their lifestyle to match their income. They didn't expect their kids to subsidize their choices." The comparison stung because it highlighted what Samantha had been avoiding. Her parents had options. They simply chose not to exercise. The apartment they rented was twice the size they needed. Richard's truck payment was higher than her own rent. They lived like people with steady income while depending on their daughter to bridge the gap between their desires and their reality. "It's complicated," Samantha said, but the words felt hollow. "No, it's not." Emma's voice was kind, but firm. "It's actually very simple. They're adults who made choices that led to financial problems. Instead of adjusting their lifestyle, they've made those problems yours. And you've let them because you're afraid that saying no means you don't love them." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Samantha wanted to argue, to defend the arrangement that had defined her adult life, but Emma's words had found there. "Mark, the fear was real, the terror that boundaries meant abandonment, that self-preservation was selfishness." "What if something happens to them?" Samantha asked quietly. "What if they really can't manage without help? Then they'll figure it out, like millions of other adults do every day." Emma reached across the table, covering Samantha's hand with her own. "Sam, you're killing yourself for people who take your sacrifice for granted." "Time? They said thank you? Really said it? Not just you're such a good daughter before asking for more money?" Again, Samantha found herself searching through memories, looking for gratitude that went beyond the casual assumption that her support was simply what good daughters provided. The search came up empty. They talked for another hour, Emma's questions growing more pointed, Samantha's defenses wearing thinner with each exchange. By the time they parted ways, something fundamental had shifted, not resolutions. Samantha wasn't ready for that, but the first crack in the foundation of assumptions she'd built her adult life around. Walking to her car, Samantha felt like someone had handed her a mirror after years of avoiding her reflection. The image wasn't flattering. A woman in her prime, educated and capable, living like someone decades older who'd already given up on dreams. The recognition was uncomfortable, even painful. It was also, for the first time in years, honest. As she drove home through Portland's quiet streets, Emma's questions echoed alongside Jake's from the day before, creating a chorus of doubt she could no longer ignore. The weight of obligation she'd carried so long was beginning to feel less like love and more like a choice one she'd made without fully understanding its cost. Samantha's phone buzzed as she pulled into her parents' apartment complex. The familiar Tuesday evening ritual beginning with Richard's text. "Bring some of that good cheese from Whole Foods. Carol's making her special pasta tonight," the request was casual, almost cheerful, but Samantha felt the now familiar weight of expectation behind it. "Meet me at Clyde Common in an hour. We need to talk." Samantha found Emma at a corner table, already nursing a glass of wine and wearing the expression of someone who'd been planning a difficult conversation. Emma had always been direct. It was what had made their friendship survive 28 years and 1,000 miles of distance. Tonight, that directness felt particularly sharp. "You look terrible," Emma said without preamble, standing to hug her friend. "When was the last time you bought clothes that actually fit?" Samantha glanced down at her oversized sweater, a clearance rack find from 2 years ago. "Nice to see you too. How was Denver?" "Don't deflect." Emma's dark eyes were serious as they sat down. "I've been watching your social media. No new posts about anything fun. No pictures of that cute nurse you mentioned. No house hunting updates. Just hospital selfies and family dinner photos that look like hostage situations." "That's not Sam." Emma's voice carried the authority of someone who'd known her since they were 10 years old and building forts in suburban Ohio backyards. I've been your friend for almost 3 decades. It's my know when you're drowning, even when you're too proud to admit it. The words hit harder than intended. Samantha felt her careful composure beginning to crack. The weight of Jake's questions from the day before, combining with Emma's unflinching observation. "They're my parents," she said, the defense, sounding weak even to her own ears. "And you're their daughter, not their retirement plan." Emma leaned forward, her voice gentle but uncompromising. "When was the last time they asked how you were doing?" Really asked, not just how's work, so they could segue into their latest financial need. Samantha tried to remember, searching through recent conversations for genuine interest in her life that wasn't connected to her ability to provide support. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "They're struggling," she said finally. "Dad's business failed, Mom's health isn't great, and they're trying to figure out retirement without much savings. Because they spent their retirement money on what, cruises? Home improvements? Is that new truck your dad bought last year?" Emma's questions were precise, formed by years of listening to Samantha's careful updates about her parents' latest purchases. "That's not." Samantha stopped, remembering Richard's excitement about the truck's upgraded sound system, Carol's detailed descriptions of their recent anniversary cruise to Alaska. Luxuries purchased while their daughter worked overtime too. Cover their basic expenses. "You know what my parents did when money got tight?" Emma continued. "They downsized. Sold the house, moved to a smaller apartment, adjusted their lifestyle to match their income. They didn't expect their kids to subsidize their choices." The comparison stung because it highlighted what Samantha had been avoiding. Her parents had options. They simply chose not to exercise. The apartment they rented was twice the size they needed. Richard's truck payment was higher than her own rent. They lived like people with steady income while depending on their daughter to bridge the gap between their desires and their reality. "It's complicated," Samantha said, but the words felt hollow. "No, it's not." Emma's voice was kind, but firm. "It's actually very simple. They're adults who made choices that led to financial problems. Instead of adjusting their lifestyle, they've made those problems yours. And you've let them because you're afraid that saying no means you don't love them." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Samantha wanted to argue, to defend the arrangement that had defined her adult life, but Emma's words had found there. Mark, the fear was real, the terror that boundaries meant abandonment, that self-preservation was selfishness. "What if something happens to them?" Samantha asked quietly. "What if they really can't manage without help? Then they'll figure it out, like millions of other adults do every day." Emma reached across the table, covering Samantha's hand with her own. "Sam, you're killing yourself for people who take your sacrifice for granted. Time, they said thank you? Really said it? Not just you're such a good daughter before asking for more money?" Again, Samantha found herself searching through memories, looking for gratitude that went beyond the casual assumption that her support was simply what good daughters provided. The search came up empty. They talked for another hour, Emma's questions growing more pointed, Samantha's defenses wearing thinner with each exchange. By the time they parted ways, something fundamental had shifted, not resolutions. Samantha wasn't ready for that. But the first crack in the foundation of assumptions she'd built her adult life around. Walking to her car, Samantha felt like someone had handed her a mirror after years of avoiding her reflection. The image wasn't flattering. A woman in her prime, educated and capable, living like someone decades older who'd already given up on dreams. The recognition was uncomfortable, even painful. It was also, for the first time in years, honest. As she drove home through Portland's quiet streets, Emma's questions echoed alongside Jake's from the day before, creating a chorus of doubt she could no longer ignore. The weight of obligation she'd carried so long was beginning to feel less like love and more like a choice one she'd made without fully understanding its cost. Samantha's phone buzzed as she pulled into her parents' apartment complex. The familiar Tuesday evening ritual beginning with Richard's text. "Bring some of that good cheese from Whole Foods. Carol's making her special pasta tonight." The request was casual, almost cheerful, but Samantha felt the now familiar weight of expectation behind it. "Meet me at Clyde Common in an hour. We need to talk." Samantha found Emma at a corner table, already nursing a glass of wine and wearing the expression of someone who'd been planning a difficult conversation. Emma had always been direct. It was what had made their friendship survive 28 years and 1,000 miles of distance. Tonight, that directness felt particularly sharp. "You look terrible," Emma said without preamble, standing to hug her friend. "When was the last time you bought clothes that actually fit?" Samantha glanced down at her oversized sweater, a clearance rack find from 2 years ago. "Nice to see you too. How was Denver?" "Don't deflect." Emma's dark eyes were serious as they sat down. "I've been watching your social media. No new posts about anything fun. No pictures of that cute nurse you mentioned. No house hunting updates. Just hospital selfies and family dinner photos that look like hostage situations." "That's not Sam." Emma's voice carried the authority of someone who'd known her since they were 10 years old and building forts in suburban Ohio backyards. "I've been your friend for almost 3 decades. It's my know when you're drowning, even when you're too proud to admit it." The words hit harder than intended. Samantha felt her careful composure beginning to crack. The weight of Jake's questions from the day before, combining with Emma's unflinching observation. "They're my parents," she said, the defense sounding weak even to her own ears. "And you're their daughter, not their retirement plan." Emma leaned forward, her voice gentle but uncompromising. "When was the last time they asked how you were doing?" Really asked, not just how's work, so they could segue into their latest financial need. Samantha tried to remember, searching through recent conversations for genuine interest in her life that wasn't connected to her ability to provide support. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "They're struggling," she said finally. "Dad's business failed, Mom's health isn't great, and they're trying to figure out retirement without much savings. Because they spent their retirement money on what, cruises? Home improvements? Is that new truck your dad bought last year?" Emma's questions were precise, formed by years of listening to Samantha's careful updates about her parents' latest purchases. "That's not." Samantha stopped, remembering Richard's excitement about the truck's upgraded sound system, Carol's detailed descriptions of their recent anniversary cruise to Alaska, luxuries purchased while their daughter worked overtime to cover their basic expenses. "You know what my parents did when money got tight?" Emma continued. "They downsized. Sold the house, moved to a smaller apartment, adjusted their lifestyle to match their income. They didn't expect their kids to subsidize their choices." The comparison stung because it highlighted what Samantha had been avoiding. Her parents had options. They simply chose not to exercise. The apartment they rented was twice the size they needed. Richard's truck payment was higher than her own rent. They lived like people with steady income while depending on their daughter to bridge the gap between their desires and their reality. "It's complicated," Samantha said, but the words felt hollow. "No, it's not." Emma's voice was kind, but firm. "It's actually very simple. They're adults who made choices that led to financial problems. Instead of adjusting their lifestyle, they've made those problems yours. And you've let them because you're afraid that saying no means you don't love them." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Samantha wanted to argue, to defend the arrangement that had defined her adult life, but Emma's words had found there. Mark, the fear was real, the terror that boundaries meant abandonment, that self-preservation was selfishness. "What if something happens to them?" Samantha asked quietly. "What if they really can't manage without help? Then they'll figure it out, like millions of other adults do every day." Emma reached across the table, covering Samantha's hand with her own. "Sam, you're killing yourself for people who take your sacrifice for granted." "Time? They said thank you? Really said it? Not just you're such a good daughter before asking for more money?" Again, Samantha found herself searching through memories, looking for gratitude that went beyond the casual assumption that her support was simply what good daughters provided. The search came up empty. They talked for another hour, Emma's questions growing more pointed, Samantha's defenses wearing thinner with each exchange. By the time they parted ways, something fundamental had shifted, not resolutions. Samantha wasn't ready for that, but the first crack in the foundation of assumptions she'd built her adult life around. Walking to her car, Samantha felt like someone had handed her a mirror after years of avoiding her reflection. The image wasn't flattering. A woman in her prime, educated and capable, living like someone decades older who'd already given up on dreams. The recognition was uncomfortable. even painful. It was also, for the first time in years, honest. As she drove home through Portland's quiet streets, Emma's questions echoed alongside Jake's from the day before, creating a chorus of doubt she could no longer ignore. The weight of obligation she'd carried so long was beginning to feel less like love and more like a choice one she'd made without fully understanding its cost. Samantha's phone buzzed as she pulled into her parents' apartment complex. The familiar Tuesday evening ritual beginning with Richard's text. "Bring some of that good cheese from Whole Foods. Carol's making her special pasta tonight," the request was casual, almost cheerful, but Samantha felt the now familiar weight of expectation behind it. Since Emma's visit 3 days ago, every interaction with her parents had taken on a different texture. Where once she'd seen love and need, she now detected entitlement and assumption. She climbed the stairs with grocery bags that included $15 cheese, wondering when she'd stop noticing how her parents' requests had evolved from desperate pleas to casual demands. The pasta Carol was making used ingredients that cost more than Samantha's own dinners for a week, but questioning it had become unthinkable somewhere along the way. "Perfect timing," Carol called from the kitchen as Samantha let herself in. "I was just about to start the sauce. Did you get the good Parmesan? The pre-grated stuff just isn't the same." Samantha handed over the expensive wedge of cheese, noting how her mother accepted it without comment, as if $20 cheese was simply what daughters provided. Richard looked up from his laptop, where travel websites glowed with promise. "Glad you're here, honey. I want to show you something exciting." His enthusiasm was infectious, the way it had been when she was a child, and he'd had genuinely good news to share. "Carol and I have been talking, and we think it's time to renovate the bathroom. Nothing fancy, just updating the fixtures. Maybe putting in one of those walk-in showers." Samantha set down the groceries carefully. "Didn't we just talk about being careful with money?" "That's the beauty of it," Richard continued, his excitement undimmed. "Home improvements are investments. We're not spending money, we're building equity. Besides, the current bathroom is practically falling apart." Carol appeared with wine glasses, pouring without asking if Samantha wanted any. "The shower door doesn't close properly, and the toilet runs constantly. It's really becoming a problem." As they moved to the dining room, Samantha noticed the bathroom door stood open, revealing fixtures that looked tired but functional. The shower door that didn't close properly seemed to shut just fine. The constantly running toilet was silent. But pointing out these discrepancies had become impossible somewhere. In the last 3 years, her parents' problems had become facts, rather than interpretations. Dinner conversation flowed around renovation plans that grew more elaborate with each course. Richard described heated floors, and Carol mentioned a double vanity she'd seen in a magazine. The numbers they discussed casually, 15,000. Maybe 20 represented more than Samantha's entire emergency fund. "Of course, we'll need to figure out financing," Richard said, cutting his pasta with deliberate care. Banks aren't exactly eager to lend to people our age, especially with my employment situation." The comment hung in the air like a question that wasn't quite being asked. Samantha felt the familiar pressure building, the expectation that she would volunteer to solve their problem before they had to explicitly request her help. "Maybe you should wait until you're working again," she suggested carefully, "or consider smaller updates that don't require major financing." Carol's face fell with practiced disappointment. "Honey, your father isn't getting any younger. These kinds of projects need to happen while we can still enjoy them. Besides, we're not talking about luxury here. This is basic maintenance." The conversation continued through dessert. Renovation dreams expanding to include new lighting and perhaps refinishing the hardwood floors. With each addition, Samantha felt the weight of anticipated obligation pressing heavier on her chest. Then Richard set down his wine glass and smiled with the satisfaction of someone about to share particularly good news. "There is one thing we should probably mention, sweetheart. Carol and I have been updating our estate planning." Finally, Carol added with evident relief, "We should have done this years ago." Samantha nodded politely, expecting to hear about powers of attorney or healthcare directives, the responsible planning her parents should have addressed long ago. "We've decided to keep things simple," Richard continued. "Most of our assets will go to St. Vincent's. They do such good work with homeless services. And there's a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids that really spoke to us. The words took a moment to penetrate. Samantha set down her fork, sure she'd misunderstood. You're donating everything to charity? Not everything, Carol said. Quickly, there will be small amounts for you and Amanda, of course. But Richard and I talked it over, and we realized we don't want to burden you girls with managing property or investments. It's really much cleaner this way. The casual tone, the way they discussed erasing her future inheritance like they were choosing a restaurant, left Samantha momentarily speechless. She'd never counted on an inheritance, had never built plans around money that wasn't hers. But the dismissive ease of the announcement felt like a slap. Besides, Richard added, reaching for more wine, it's not like you girls need our help. You're both independent, successful adults. We raised you to take care of yourselves. The irony was so profound that Samantha wondered if it was intentional. Cruelty disguised as casual conversation. They were planning to donate the money she'd been helping them preserve, while in the same breath dismissing years of financial support as irrelevant to their decision. Dad, she said slowly, I've been helping with your expenses for 3 years, and we appreciate that, honey. But that's different. That's what family does for each other. This is about our legacy, about making a real difference in the world. Carol nodded enthusiastically. We want to be remembered for helping people who really need it, not just passing money down to people who are already doing fine. The words hit like physical blows. Samantha looked around the table at the expensive cheese she'd bought, the renovation plans that would require her financial backing, the wine glasses filled with bottles that cost more than her weekly grocery. Budgetan felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. What about the bathroom renovation? She asked quietly. Oh, that's different, Richard waved dismissively. That's maintenance, not wealth building. We'll figure something out. The something was her, of course. Always her. The renovation would be financed with her credit, her savings, her sacrifice. But the improved property value would ultimately benefit charity, not the daughter who'd made it possible. Don't expect any help when we're gone, Carol added with a laugh that sounded almost proud. We're teaching you independence, even after death. The comment was delivered like a gift, as if financial abandonment was actually generous parenting. Samantha stared at her parents, really looked at them for perhaps the first time in years, and saw strangers wearing familiar faces. People who had somehow convinced themselves that taking her money was noble while leaving her nothing was character building. You know what? Samantha stood up slowly, her voice remarkably calm. I think I should go. But we haven't talked about the renovation financing yet, Richard protested. I have some preliminary quotes to show you. I'm sure you do. Samantha gathered her purse, her movements deliberate and controlled. I'm sure you have it all figured out. Carol looked confused, as if the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Sweetheart, you seem upset. Did we say something wrong? Samantha paused at the door, looking back at her parents. They seemed genuinely puzzled by her reaction, as if discussing their plans to donate her inheritance while expecting her continued financial support was perfectly reasonable. No, she said finally. You said exactly what you meant to say. She left them sitting at the table, their voices following her down the hallway with confused protests and promises to call later. But for the first time in 3 years, Samantha wasn't listening to their needs, their explanations, their expectations. She was finally hearing her own voice, and it was telling her something she should have recognized long ago. Love shouldn't cost everything you have while giving nothing in return. Samantha sat in her car outside her parents' apartment complex for 20 minutes after leaving their dinner table, her hands gripping the steering wheel as waves of emotion crashed over her. Anger, hurt, and something that felt dangerously close. To relief warred in her chest while traffic moved past in the gathering Portland dusk. The conversation replayed in fragments, her parents' casual discussion of donating her inheritance while expecting her continued financial support, their dismissive attitude toward years of sacrifice. The renovation plans that assumed her money, without acknowledging her generosity. Each memory felt like touching a fresh burn. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carol. I think there was a misunderstanding. Call me when you get home. Samantha stared at the message, recognizing the familiar pattern. Confusion rather than accountability, the suggestion that her reaction was based on misinterpretation rather than their actual words. The gaslighting was so subtle, so practiced, that she wondered how long they'd been rewriting reality to avoid taking responsibility for their choices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She drove home through familiar streets that seemed different now, as if the conversation had shifted something fundamental in her perception. The small apartment she'd been embarrassed to show, Jake suddenly looked like a sanctuary rather than a compromise. Her secondhand furniture, her careful budgeting, her modest dreams, they were hers. Earned through her own work rather than someone else's sacrifice. That night, sleep came in fragments. Samantha found herself staring at the ceiling, calculating numbers that had become frighteningly familiar. $3,000 a month for 3 years, more than $100,000 transferred from her account to theirs. Money that could have been a house down payment, graduate school tuition, retirement fund that didn't exist because she'd been funding someone else's. The next morning at work, Jake noticed immediately. He looked like someone who didn't sleep, he observed, appearing beside her at the medication cart with 2 cups of coffee. "Family dinner," Samantha said, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was illuminating. Something in her tone made Jake study her more closely. "Want to talk about it?" Suddenly she did, standing in the hospital corridor between patient rounds. Samantha found herself telling Jake about the dinner, about her parents' renovation plans and inheritance decisions. The words came out in a rush, 3 years of suppressed frustration pouring out like water through a broken dam. Jake listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sam," he said finally, "you know, this isn't normal, right? Parents don't usually take money from their kids while planning to leave everything to charity." "I know," she said, and realized she did know, had probably known for months, maybe years, but had been too afraid to acknowledge it. "I just don't know what to do about it." "What do you want to do?" The question was simple, but revolutionary. When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted rather than what she owed? Samantha felt something loosen in her chest space, opening up around possibilities she'd forgotten existed. "I want to stop," she said quietly. "I want to go back to school. I want to buy a house. I want to date someone without feeling guilty about spending money on dinner instead of sending it to my parents." Jake's smile was warm and encouraging. "Those all sound like reasonable things to want. But what if they really can't manage without my help? Then they'll downsize or get jobs or figure out what millions of other people do when they can't afford their lifestyle." His voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel. "Sam, you're not responsible for protecting them from the consequences of their choices." That afternoon, Samantha called Emma during her lunch break, needing to hear her friend's voice. "You sound different," Emma said immediately. "What happened?" Samantha described the dinner, her parents' casual dismissal of her sacrifice, while assuming her continued support. Emma's responses grew increasingly sharp with each detail. "They're planning to donate money you helped them save while expecting you to finance their bathroom renovation?" Emma's voice carried the outrage Samantha had been afraid to feel herself. "Sam, that's not family obligation. That's financial abuse." The term hit like cold water. Samantha had never thought of it that way, had always framed her parents' behavior as unfortunate rather than deliberately harmful. But Emma's words forced her to consider whether the pattern was really accidental, the guilt trips when she expressed financial stress. The way her parents' needs always took precedence, their complete lack of interest in her own goals and dreams. "I think I need to stop paying for their stuff," Samantha said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Good," Emma said firmly. "It's about time." "But what if no?" Emma interrupted. "No what-ifs. No catastrophizing. They're adults who made choices. Let them live with the consequences." That evening, Samantha sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and calculator, doing something she hadn't done in 3 years, planning for her own future. She researched nurse practitioner programs, calculated what she could save if she stopped supporting her parents, looked at house prices in neighborhoods she'd thought were beyond her reach. The numbers were startling. Without the drain of her parents' expenses, she could apply to graduate school within 6 months. She could save for a house down payment within 2 years. She could have a retirement account, an emergency fund, money for travel or hobbies, or the simple luxury of buying groceries without calculating every purchase. Her phone rang as she was browsing program requirements for Portland State's nurse practitioner track. Her father's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in years, Samantha let it go to voicemail. The message was vintage Richard, concerned but slightly irritated, suggesting she call back when she had time to clear up whatever misunderstanding happened at dinner. No acknowledgement of what they'd actually said, no recognition that her reaction might be justified, just the assumption that her feelings were wrong and her continued support was guaranteed. Samantha deleted the message without calling back. Over the next 2 days, she made a series of small but significant changes. She researched graduate school applications and financial aid. She opened a separate savings account specifically for her own goals. She looked at apartments closer to the hospital, places where she could walk to work and save on gas money she'd been using to visit her parents. Most importantly, she practiced saying no, standing in front of her bathroom mirror. She rehearsed responses to her parents' requests. "I can't afford that right now. That's not in my budget. You'll need to figure out another solution." The words felt foreign at first, like speaking a language she'd never learned. But with repetition, they began to feel possible, even necessary. On Thursday morning, she made the decision formal. Sitting in her car before her shift, Samantha transferred her parents' rent money back into her own savings account. The action felt both terrifying and liberating, the first time in 3 years she'd chosen her own financial security over their comfort. Her phone immediately buzzed with a text from her father. The rent check bounced. "Call me." Samantha stared at the message, her heart racing with fear and excitement in equal measure. This was at the moment where she stopped being a victim of her own generosity and started being an author of her own life. She typed back, "I know. We need to talk." Then she put her phone away and walked into the hospital, ready to begin the most difficult conversation of her adult life, and perhaps the most important one. Samantha's phone had been buzzing incessantly for 2 hours before she finally answered. Richard's call during her afternoon break. She'd watched his name appear on her screen 17 times, each missed call building her resolve rather than weakening it. When she finally picked up, his voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose assumptions had been challenged. "What the hell is going on?" the landlord called, saying our rent check bounced. "I know you didn't forget. You've never missed a payment." "I didn't forget, Dad." Samantha kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I didn't send the money." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for her to wonder if the call had dropped. When Richard spoke again, his tone had shifted from irritation to confusion. "What do you mean you didn't send it? Is there a problem with your bank? Did someone steal your identity?" The questions came rapid fire, each one revealing how completely inconceivable it was to her father that she might have chosen not to pay. His mind cycled through external problems, bank errors, fraud, technical glitches, anything except the possibility that his daughter had made a deliberate decision. "There's no problem with my bank," Samantha said carefully. "I've decided I can't continue paying your rent and expenses. I need to focus on my own financial future." Another silence, this one heavier than the first. When Richard's voice returned, it carried a dangerous quiet that Samantha remembered from childhood arguments. "Hey, you can't be serious!" "This isn't some game, Samantha. We have bills due, obligations to meet. You can't just decide to abandon your responsibilities." "My responsibilities?" The word felt sharp in her mouth. "Dad, I'm 28 years old. Our responsibility is to myself and my own future. After everything we've done for you, after we raised you, put you through school, sacrificed our own comfort to give you opportunities." Richard's voice was rising now, the controlled anger giving way to genuine outrage. "This is how you repay that." The guilt hit like a familiar drug, flooding her system with the need to apologize, to fix things, to make the disappointment in his voice disappear. But Emma's words echoed in her memory. What did they sacrifice? And Jake's quiet observation. "You're not responsible for protecting them from the consequences of their choices." "What school did you put me through?" Samantha asked quietly. I paid for nursing school myself with loans I'm still repaying. I worked 3 jobs to afford it. We gave you a roof over your head, food on the table until I was 18. Like parents are supposed to do. Samantha felt something shifting inside her, a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. Dad, taking care of children isn't a debt they owe you for the rest of their lives. It's what you signed up for when you decided to have kids. Don't you dare lecture me about parenting. Richard's voice had turned cold, the disappointed father replaced by someone Samantha barely recognized. We didn't raise you to be selfish, to turn your back on family when things get difficult. When did things get difficult for me? The question surprised them both. When did you ask how I was doing, whether I could afford to help? What supporting you was costing me? You never said you couldn't afford it, because every time I mentioned money being tight, you told me about your stress, Mom's health problems, how hard things were for you. Samantha's voice was gaining strength with each word. I learned not to complain because my problems weren't as important as yours. The phone went quiet except for the sound of Richard's breathing. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. To the wounded parent, the voice he used when reason failed and emotional manipulation took over. I can't believe this is my daughter talking. The girl we raised to care about family, to understand that we're all we have in this world. His voice cracked slightly. Your mother's going to be devastated. You know how fragile she is? There it was, the threat disguised as concern, the suggestion that Samantha's boundaries would literally harm her mother. Carol's fragility had been weaponized for years, a way to make any resistance feel like potential violence. Mom is stronger than you give her credit for, Samantha said, though her voice wavered slightly. And both of you are capable of solving your own problems. This isn't over, Richard said, his voice hardening again. You think you can just abandon us? Cut us off without warning? I'll see how long your guilt lets you sleep at night. It's probably better than I've slept in 3 years, Samantha replied, and hung up. Her hands were shaking as she set the phone down, adrenaline flooding her system like she'd just survived a physical confrontation. In a way, she had. The conversation felt like breaking free from restraints she hadn't realized were there, painful but necessary. The phone immediately started buzzing again, Richard calling back, probably to deliver threats or ultimatums he'd thought of after hanging up. Samantha turned it face down and walked back into the hospital, where real emergencies waited, and her skills actually mattered. 20 minutes later, Jake found her in the supply closet, restocking 4 bags with hands that still trembled slightly. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost? I just told my father I'm not paying their rent anymore. The words came out flat, emotionless, like she was reporting a patient's vital signs. Jake's face shifted through several expressions: surprise, concern, and finally something that looked like pride. How did he take it? About as well as you'd expect. Guilt, manipulation, threats, emotional blackmail. Samantha counted off on her fingers. He hit every classic move in the toxic parent playbook. And how do you feel? It was such a simple question, but Samantha realized no one had asked her that in years. Her parents never inquired about her feelings unless they needed to manage them. Her feelings were obstacles to overcome, not experiences worth acknowledging. Terrified, she said honestly, and relieved, and guilty, and angry. She looked up at Jake, whose steady presence had become an anchor in the storm. Mostly angry, which is new for me. Anger can be healthy, Jake said carefully, especially when it's justified. Is it? Justified. The question came out smaller than she'd intended. The uncertainty of someone who'd spent years being told her emotions were wrong. Sam, you've been working overtime to pay for your parents' lifestyle while they plan European cruises and bathroom renovations. They're donating your inheritance to charity while expecting you to finance their retirement. Jake's voice was gentle but firm. If that doesn't justify anger, I don't know what does. The validation felt like oxygen after years of holding her breath. Someone saw what she saw, acknowledged what she'd experienced, confirmed that her reality was real. What happens now? She asked. Now you find out what you're made of, Jake said, because they're going to escalate. People don't give up control easily, especially when they've had it for years. As if summoned by his words, her phone buzzed with a text from Carol. Honey, your father told me what happened. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Call me when you can talk rationally. Samantha showed Jake the message. and his expression darkened. There it is. You're being irrational, not responding to their actual behavior. How do you know so much about this? Samantha asked. My sister went through something similar with our parents. Different circumstances, same playbook. Jake's voice carried the weight of experience. The good news is, once you stop participating in the dysfunction, you can't unsee it. Every manipulation becomes obvious. Samantha's phone buzzed again. Another text from Carol, this one longer. I'm having chest pains thinking about this situation. Please don't let a misunderstanding destroy our family. Medical emergency, Jake observed dryly. Right on schedule. Looking at the message, Samantha felt the familiar panic. What if her mother really was having chest pains? What if her boundaries were literally killing her parents? But underneath the fear was a new awareness. This was exactly what Jake meant about manipulation becoming obvious. I'm not going to respond, she said, putting the phone away. Good, Jake said. That's how you start getting your life back. Carol arrived at Portland General during Samantha's Thursday morning shift, her timing calculated for maximum disruption. Samantha was charting medications when the charge nurse approached with the carefully neutral expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. There's a woman in the family waiting area asking for you. Says she's your mother and it's urgent. Samantha's stomach dropped. She'd been expecting escalation since hanging up on her father 3 days ago, but she hadn't anticipated a public confrontation at her workplace. Through the glass doors, she could see Carol pacing the waiting area. Tissues clutched in her hand, performing distress for anyone watching. I'll handle it, Samantha said, her voice steadier than she felt. Carol looked up as Samantha entered the waiting area, her face brightening with relief that seemed genuine until Samantha noticed the carefully placed tears that hadn't quite smudged her mascara. Oh, sweetheart, thank goodness. I was so worried you wouldn't see me. Carol's voice carried just enough volume to ensure nearby families could hear the drama unfolding. I couldn't sleep last night thinking about our conversation, about how upset you seemed. Mom, this isn't the place I know, but you won't answer your phone. And I was so scared, something terrible had happened. Carol's voice cracked with practiced emotion. Your father said you were angry about the inheritance, but surely you don't think we'd actually cut you off completely. The words were chosen carefully, loud enough for others to hear but designed to make Samantha appear unreasonable. Carol was rewriting the conversation, making it about inheritance rather than years of financial support, positioning herself as the concerned mother trying to reassure her dramatic daughter. We need to discuss this privately, Samantha said firmly. Of course. But honey, you have to understand how worried we've been. Your father thinks you're having some kind of breakdown, refusing to help with the rent, talking about abandoning family. Carol's voice dropped to a stage whisper. Is it stress from work? You seeing someone for your mental health? Suggestion that her boundaries were symptoms of mental illness rather than healthy decision-making was expertly delivered. Carol managed to sound concerned while implying. Samantha was unstable, caring while suggesting her daughter needed professional help to think clearly. I'm not having a breakdown, Samantha said quietly. I'm making adult decisions about my finances. But sweetheart, we're your parents. We raised you, sacrificed for you, loved you unconditionally. Carol's voice was gaining strength, the performance hitting its stride. Doesn't that mean anything anymore? Samantha felt the familiar weight of guilt settling over her shoulders, amplified by the public setting and her mother's skilled manipulation. Several people in the waiting area were now openly watching, their expressions a mixture of sympathy for the distraught mother and judgment for the apparently heartless daughter. I need to get back to work, Samantha said. Please, just think this through. Think about your father's blood pressure, about my anxiety. We can't take this kind of stress at our age. Carol reached out, taking Samantha's hand in a gesture that looked affectionate to anyone watching, but to Samantha, it felt like a trap. We'll do anything to make this right, but we need to know you still love us. It was expert emotional manipulation tying love to financial support, equating Samantha's boundaries with abandonment, and presenting their well-being as her sole responsibility. And now, Carol had turned Samantha's workplace into a stage, hoping public discomfort would pressure her into giving in. I do love you, Samantha replied softly, but I can't keep covering your expenses. Carol's face crumpled. portrait of devastation. Then we'll lose everything. The apartment, our independence, our dignity. Is that really what you want? Before Samantha could say another word, Carol turned and walked away, her shoulders shaking with exaggerated sobs that filled the hospital's waiting room. The scene was complete. The grieving mother, the cold daughter, the family torn apart. By selfishness, as Samantha returned to her unit, she could feel eyes on her. During lunch, the charge nurse approached. "Everything all right?" Your mom seemed really upset. "Just a family disagreement," Samantha said carefully, unwilling to unpack years of financial strain in a break-room conversation. Must have been bad for her to show up here. She seemed really concerned. The insinuation was clear. Only truly worried mothers show up at work unannounced. Carol's performance had succeeded in planting doubt. Portraying Samantha as unstable and herself as the caring parent, her phone buzzed nonstop through the afternoon texts from her father. "Richard, growing more hostile. Your selfishness is sending your mother into panic attacks. You want to tear this family apart. We'll learn to live without you. Don't expect us to be around when you realize what you've done. Even Amanda thinks you've lost it. She's ashamed of what you've become." That last one hurt the most. Amanda, her younger sister, had long kept her distance from the family's financial chaos. Now it seemed she was being pulled in as a weapon. Later that evening, Samantha microwaved a dinner she could finally eat without guilt. Amanda called. "Sam, what is going on?" "Dad called me in tears. Said you've abandoned them. Said Mom collapsed at your hospital." Amanda's voice was a mix of concern and blame. "That's not exactly what happened. Then help me understand." "From what I'm hearing, you've just cut them off when they need you the most." Samantha began explaining everything: the years of paying their bills, the inheritance situation, the unacknowledged sacrifices. But as she spoke, she could tell how it must sound to someone who hadn't lived through it. "I get that things have been complicated," Amanda replied, "but they're older now. Dad's not going to find work again, and Mom's health is declining. Maybe they mishandled some things, but does that mean you just stop helping? Why can't you help?" It came out sharper than she intended. "You know, I'm still in school. You're 25. You have a grad assistantship and a trust fund from Grandma. You've just chosen to stay out of it." Amanda went quiet when she spoke again. Her tone was defensive. "I send money when I can. Just because I don't send as much as you doesn't mean I don't care." "How much?" "That's not really the how much, Amanda. Maybe $200 a month. Sometimes less if things are tight." Her voice had shrunk, the gap between their contributions becoming unavoidable. "I've been sending $3,000 a month. For 3 years," Samantha said, "while working extra shifts, living in a tiny apartment, and putting all my plans on hold." The numbers didn't lie. Amanda had been contributing less than a tenth of what Samantha Gaviette still pretended. They were sharing the load. I didn't realize it was that much," Amanda whispered, "because no one ever asked. No one ever checked in to see if I could afford it. Y'all just assumed I'd take care of it, because I always have." The papers were eviction notices, medical bills, past due statements, a carefully curated collection of financial disasters that had supposedly befallen them since Samantha stopped her support. Carol dabbed at her eyes while Richard arranged the documents like evidence in a trial. "The landlord filed for eviction," Carol said, her voice trembling. "We're going to lose our home because we can't make the rent without your help." Samantha picked up the eviction notice, noting immediately that it was dated before she'd stopped paying their rent. The timeline didn't match their narrative. This was a consequence of their financial mismanagement, not her boundaries. "This is dated 3 weeks ago," she observed. "I was still paying your rent then." "Well, yes, but..." Richard's explanation stumbled. "Yes. We were already behind from previous months. Your support wasn't enough to catch up with everything we owed." The admission revealed what Samantha had suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge: her money had never been enough to actually solve their problems. They'd been using her payments to subsidize their lifestyle while their fundamental financial issues continued to compound. "What about the medical bills?" she asked, examining a stack of papers from various healthcare providers. "Your mother's been having chest pains," Richard said, his tone accusatory. "The stress of this situation has been literally killing her." Carol nodded weakly. pressing her hand to her chest in a gesture that looked rehearsed. The doctor says, "It's anxiety-related, but the tests were expensive. Insurance doesn't cover everything." Samantha scanned the medical bills, her nursing background making the charges easier to interpret than her parents probably expected. Emergency room visits for chest pain, stress tests, cardiac monitoring, all legitimate medical expenses. But the dates told a different story. "These bills are from 6 months ago," she said quietly. "You've been having chest pain since before any of this started." The observation hung in the air like an accusation. Carol's performance wavered slightly, her hand dropping from her chest as she realized her medical emergency narrative had been undermined by documentation. "The point is," Richard said, his voice hardening, "we're facing homelessness and medical bankruptcy because you decided to abandon your family obligations. Is that really the person you want to be?" The familiar guilt pressed against Samantha's chest. But this time it felt different, less like truth, and more like a tool being wielded against her. She looked at her parents sitting in her small apartment, surrounded by evidence of their own poor choices, and felt something shift permanently. "You're not homeless," she said calmly. "You're facing consequences for spending money you didn't have on things you didn't need while expecting me to cover your basic expenses." "That's not fair," Carol protested. "We're not asking for luxuries. We just need help with survival." "Survival," Samantha gestured toward the papers. "Dad, there's a receipt here for $500 at a casino dated last week." "Mom, you bought a $100 facial treatment while claiming you couldn't afford medication." The evidence was undeniable, scattered across her coffee table like a map of their priorities. They'd been claiming poverty while maintaining discretionary spending that exceeded Samantha's own budget for necessities. "Those were circumstances," Richard said, his authority crumbling. "We needed to relieve stress." "Then relieve it with your own money," Samantha said, her voice growing stronger. "Figure out a budget that works with your actual income instead of the income you think you deserve." Carol began crying, not the manipulative tears of her hospital performance, but genuine distress at finding their tactics ineffective. "You're really going to let us lose everything?" "I'm going to let you take responsibility for your own choices," Samantha replied. "Something I should have done years ago." Richard stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Fine. If this is how you want it, don't expect us to be here when you realize your mistake. Don't expect us to welcome you back when your guilt finally catches up with you." "I won't," Samantha said simply. The words seemed to deflate something in her father. He'd expected guilt, negotiation, eventual capitulation. Instead, he'd found a daughter who'd finally learned to value her own worth over his approval. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat sounded hollow. "Yes, it is," Samantha replied, opening her door. "It's been over for a long time. Just finally stop pretending otherwise." Carol gathered the papers with shaking hands, while Richard stomped toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back with one final attempt at control. "You'll regret this. Family is all you have in the end, and you're throwing it away for what? Some fantasy about graduate school? Throwing away guilt and obligation disguised as love," Samantha said. "I'm keeping the family. I'm just redefining what that means." After they left, Samantha sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her graduate school application. The confrontation had been painful, but clarifying. She'd seen her parents clearly for perhaps the first time in her adult life, not as victims of circumstance, but as people who'd made deliberate choices and expected others to absorb the consequences. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "How did it go?"
"Not yet."
"It's over," she typed back. "Really over. How do you feel?" Samantha considered the question carefully, taking inventory of her emotional state. The guilt was still there, but fainter, now overshadowed by something she hadn't felt in years. "Free," she replied. "I feel free." For the first time since she'd been 18 years old, Samantha Williams belonged entirely to herself. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating, the beginning of a life she'd almost forgotten she was allowed to want. 6 months later, Samantha stood in the doorway of her new house, a small craftsman bungalow in Southeast Portland with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that actually had counter space. The mortgage payment was less than what she'd been sending her parents monthly, a fact that still amazed her every time she wrote the check. "The moving truck should be here in an hour," Jake called from the kitchen, where he was assembling boxes with the methodical precision of someone who'd helped friends move too many times to count. Their relationship had evolved slowly from colleagues, two friends, to something deeper, built on mutual respect rather than need. "I still can't believe this is mine," Samantha said, running her hand along the built-in bookshelf that had sold her on the place. "6 months ago, I was living in a studio apartment and convinced I'd never afford anything better." The transformation had been remarkable in its simplicity. Without the drain of her parents' expenses, Samantha's financial situation had improved dramatically. She'd saved for a down payment, qualified for a mortgage, and begun the graduate program at OHSU, all things that had seemed impossible. When she was subsidizing someone else's lifestyle, her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Saw the house. Photos on Instagram? Looks amazing. Can't wait to visit next month." Emma had been her strongest supporter through the transition, celebrating each milestone with genuine enthusiasm. The friendship had deepened as Samantha learned to accept support without feeling obligated to reciprocate in kinda healthy dynamics she'd never experienced with her family. "Any word from your parents?" Jake asked, reading her expression as she set down the phone. "Radio silence for the past month," Samantha replied. "I think they finally accepted that I'm not coming back to the arrangement." The months following their confrontation had been a masterclass in manipulation tactics. Richard and Carol had cycled through every strategy in their arsenal: guilt, anger, medical emergencies, financial disasters, and attempts to recruit other family members as intermediaries. Each escalation had been met with Samantha's calm but firm boundaries, until even they seemed to realize the game was over. "How are you feeling about that?" It was the question Jake asked regularly, his way of checking in without being intrusive. Samantha had learned to appreciate his direct communication style, so different from her family's passive-aggressive approach. "Sad but not guilty," she said, the distinction important. "I'm mourning the relationship I thought we had, not the one we actually had." The doorbell rang, followed by a knock that sounded tentative rather than demanding. Through the window, Samantha saw Amanda standing on the porch, looking nervous but determined. "That's unexpected," Samantha said, opening the door to find her sister holding a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of someone who'd been rehearsing an apology. "I know I should have called," Amanda began, "but I was afraid you wouldn't want to see me after everything that happened." "Come in," Samantha said, genuinely pleased to see her sister. Their relationship had been strained but not severed. Amanda had been caught in the middle of the family drama without fully understanding the dynamics at play. Amanda looked around the house with obvious admiration. "Sam, this is beautiful. I can't believe you've accomplished all this." "Thanks," Samantha said, leading her to the living room where Jake was discreetly giving them space. "Amanda, you remember Jake from my stories? It's a good influence," Amanda said with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Nice to finally meet you in person." Jake excused himself to continue unpacking, leaving the sisters alone for the first time since the family confrontation. Amanda sat on the couch, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like humility. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about how much you were actually contributing to their expenses, and I realize I've been incredibly selfish." "You were protecting yourself," Samantha said carefully. "That's not necessarily wrong. But I let you carry the burden alone while pretending we were both helping equally." Amanda's voice carried genuine remorse. "When you finally set boundaries, I judged you for it instead of supporting you." The apology felt genuine, different from the manipulative pseudo-accountability their parents had occasionally offered. Amanda seemed to understand not just what she'd done wrong, but why it mattered. "How are they doing?" Samantha asked, curious despite herself. "They've figured it out mostly. Dad got a part-time job at a hardware store, and Mom's been doing bookkeeping for a small business. They had to move to a smaller apartment, but they're managing." Amanda paused, choosing her words carefully. "They're angry, but they're surviving." The news brought relief rather than guilt. Samantha had worried that her boundaries might literally harm her parents. but they'd proven capable of adaptation when forced to confront reality. They ask about you, Amanda continued. Not in a way that suggests they understand what they did wrong, but they miss you, in their own limited way. I miss them too, Samantha admitted, but I don't miss the relationship we had. I can't go back to being their financial safety net. I don't think they expect you to anymore. The last few months have been a wake-up call about what they can actually afford versus what they want to afford. They talked for another hour, Amanda sharing updates about her own life, a serious relationship, plans to move back to Oregon after graduation, a growing understanding of healthy family dynamics. The conversation felt like the beginning of an adult relationship between equals rather than the child-sibling dynamic they'd maintained for years. I'm proud of you, Amanda said as she prepared to leave. I know this wasn't easy, but you've built something amazing here. After Amanda left, Samantha found Jake in the kitchen, unpacking dishes with the careful attention of someone who'd been listening without eavesdropping. Good visit? He asked. Better than I expected? I think she's finally starting to understand what happened. And how do you feel about your parents' situation? Samantha considered the question, taking inventory of her emotional response to learning about her parents' adjustments. The guilt she'd expected was minimal, overshadowed by something that felt like validation. Relieved, she said finally. They're proving they were capable of handling their problems all along. Oh, they just preferred to make them my problems instead. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. People rise to the occasion when they have to. Your parents had no reason to change as long as you were willing to enable their choices. I spent 3 years believing I was helping them, Samantha said. But I was actually preventing them from helping themselves. The insight felt like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been assembling for months. Her boundaries hadn't harmed. They'd forced her parents to develop the skills they'd always possessed, but never needed to use. That evening, as they ate takeout on the floor of her new living room, Samantha felt the deep satisfaction of a life that finally belonged to her. The house was modest but beautiful. The relationship with Jake was healthy and reciprocal, and the graduate program was challenging but manageable. What's next? Jake asked, following her gaze around the room. I'm not sure, Samantha said, and realized the uncertainty felt exciting rather than anxiety-provoking. For the first time in years, I get to decide based on what I want rather than what someone else needs. The freedom was intoxicating, tinged with the bittersweet recognition of what she'd almost lost by prioritizing others' comfort over her own growth. But there was no going back now, only forward, into a future she was finally free to create. 1 year after the Breaking Point dinner, Samantha arrived at her clinical rotation at OHSU's pediatric cardiac unit with the quiet confidence of someone who'd finally found her place in the world. The nurse practitioner program was demanding, but fulfilling each day, bringing her closer to the specialization she'd dreamed about for years. Williams, you're with Dr. Martinez in room 302 today, the charge nurse announced, handing her a chart for a 6-year-old boy scheduled for a routine follow-up after heart surgery. Samantha had grown to love these interactions. Of medical expertise and emotional support that pediatric cardiology required. Children's hearts were both more resilient and more fragile than adults, requiring a delicate balance of technical skill and genuine caring. The morning passed quickly, filled with patient assessments and treatment planning. During her lunch break, she found herself in the family lounge, where a young nurse named Maria sat staring at her phone with an expression Samantha recognized. Immediately, the overwhelmed look of someone drowning in obligations they couldn't escape. Rough day? Samantha asked, settling into the chair across from her. Maria looked up, startled. Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Just family stuff. You know how it is. The phrase triggered memories of her own deflections, the way she'd minimized her parents' financial demands to avoid confronting their unreasonableness. Something in Maria's tone suggested this wasn't ordinary family stress. Want to talk about it? Samantha offered. Sometimes it helps to say it out loud to someone who won't judge. Maria hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Psst, my parents are pressuring me to co-sign a loan for them. They want to refinance their house but can't qualify on their own income. The situation was different from Samantha's experience, but the underlying dynamic felt familiar. Parents making financial decisions they couldn't afford while expecting their adult child to absorb the risk. "What happens if you say no?" asked gently. "They'll lose the house, probably. They've been struggling with the payments for months." Maria's voice carried the weight of someone who'd internalized responsibility for problems that weren't hers to solve. "They keep saying I'm their only hope, that family is supposed to help each other. And what happens if you say yes, but they can't make the payments? Then I'm responsible for their mortgage on top of my own student loans and rent." Maria's expression showed she understood the math, but not the implications. "But that probably won't happen. They're just going through a rough patch." Samantha recognized the optimism of someone who'd been taught to prioritize others' financial problems over their own security. The conversation could have been a transcript of her own thoughts 3 years earlier. "Can I ask you something?" Samantha said carefully. "When was the last time your parents asked about your financial situation, whether you could actually afford to take on their mortgage payments if something went wrong?" Maria was quiet for a moment, processing the question. "They know I'm doing okay. I have a good job. I'm single. I don't have kids. They figure I can handle it better than they can. But did they ask? Did they want to know what co-signing would cost you? What dreams you might have to put on hold? What risks you'd be taking?" The questions hung in the air between them. Maria's expression shifted as she considered whether her parents had shown any interest in her perspective or just assumed her compliance. "No," she said quietly. "They didn't ask. In my experience," Samantha said, "people who truly care about you want to know what they're asking you to sacrifice. They don't just assume you can handle whatever burden they need to share." Maria nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "What would you do in my situation?" "I'd probably tell them I need time to think about it, and I'd really think not just about whether I can afford the payments, but about what message I'm sending about my own priorities and boundaries." "You sound like you've been through something similar. Different circumstances, same dynamic." "It took me years to realize that protecting someone from the consequences of their choices isn't actually helping them," Samantha's voice carried. "The wisdom of hard-won experience. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people solve their own problems." They talked for another 15 minutes. Maria asking questions that revealed how thoroughly she'd internalized her parents' financial problems as her own responsibility. The conversation felt like looking in a mirror, watching her younger self grapple with obligations that felt inescapable, but were actually choices. "Thank you," Maria said as they prepared to return to work. "I've been so focused on what would happen if I said no, that I never considered what would happen if I said yes and things went wrong." "Trust your instincts," Samantha advised. "You're asking these questions for a reason." That evening, Samantha sat in her kitchen with Jake, sharing dinner and conversation in the easy rhythm they'd developed over the past year. Their relationship had grown stronger as Samantha learned to accept support without feeling obligated to reciprocate disproportionately. "Good day," Jake asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "I talked to a young nurse today who's dealing with family financial pressure. It reminded me how far I've come. And how do you feel about that?" The question had become a touchstone in their relationship, Jake's way of encouraging her to stay connected to her own emotional experience rather than losing herself in others' needs. "Grateful," she said after considering. "Grateful I learned to set boundaries while I was still young enough to build the life I wanted." Her phone buzzed with a text from her father, the first direct communication she'd received from him in 4 months. "Saw your LinkedIn post about the pediatric cardiology program. Proud of you." The message was brief, devoid of the manipulation or guilt-tripping that had characterized their previous interactions. It felt like a small step toward the possibility of a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. "How does that feel?" Jake asked, reading her expression. "Like maybe there's hope for something healthy between us eventually," she said. "Not the relationship we had, but maybe something better." "No rush," Jake said gently. "You get to decide what that looks like and when you're ready for it." The reminder felt like a gift, the assurance that her boundaries were hers to maintain or modify as she chose, not obligations she owed to others' comfort. Later that night, as Samantha reviewed her notes for tomorrow's clinical rotation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The small house she owned, the career she was building. The relationship she'd developed with Jay Collevitt had been possible only after she'd learned to value her own dreams over others' expectations. The process hadn't been easy. There had been guilt, fear, and moments when she'd questioned whether boundaries were worth the cost. But sitting in her kitchen, planning for a future that belonged entirely to her, she knew she'd made the right choice. Her phone rang a ma, calling from Denver, with updates about her own life and questions about Samantha's progress in the program. Their friendship had deepened as Samantha learned to accept support gracefully, without the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been starved of genuine care. "You sound happy," Emma observed during their conversation. "I am," Samantha realized. "For the first time in years, I'm actually happy." Happiness wasn't the desperate kind that came from avoiding conflict or meeting others' expectations. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd learned to honor her own worth, to choose relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and to build a life that reflected her values rather than her fears. As she prepared for bed in her own house, surrounded by the fruits of her own labor and choices, Samantha felt the deep peace that comes from finally living authentically. The girl who'd once sacrificed everything for others' approval had become a woman who knew her own worth, and that transformation had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.